So I started bench testing the flex fuel converter box and sensor, and am sort of at a loss of what's going on here. I've got this is some components off of my homemade injector flow bench. I've got a GSL 392 an inline filter supplying this setup, but all I did was take the supply and return off of the rail for the flow bench and just make a closed loop. So there's the outlet of the pump. It comes up, comes through this T to engage, which does nothing because it's just a non-restricted loop, through the flex fuel sensor, and then return back to the tank. And in this tank is roughly 3 gallons of E85. And I did my I did some water separation testing using API's test method, and from what I was able to determine, my E85 that I bought should be roughly 70% ethanol. But I just went to the pump and filled my VP container up with whatever came out of the pump, and that's what came out of the pump. So I'm not sure what's going on with this, whether the sensor's bad or whether the device is bad, and it's sort of a black box. I don't really know. There doesn't seem to be much documentation on how to troubleshoot the box if there was any issues, but it does seem to have like a status LED. I don't know if maybe that can be used for diagnostics or something like that, but or maybe it changes colors if there was an error or something. But basic rundown of the setup. I showed you the fuel supply loop. And these sensors, I know from experience, aren't really directional. The sensing probes that sit in line are flow through, so you can have the sensor backwards, upwards, left and right, and it doesn't really do anything. There's no orientation markings on these sensors at all, so that shouldn't have anything to do with it. But just from my my water separation method testing, I should have E85 in there, or at least E70. But so switch mode power supply, 30 amp. It powers the fuel pump as well as the flex fuel converter and the flex fuel sensor. Power and ground wires. I don't know if you can see this, but VCC goes to 12 volts, or my V plus post. Ground goes to the ground post of the power supply. V out from the flex fuel sensor goes to the white input wire on the converter box. And the converter box also shares a power and ground with the flex fuel sensor and the fuel pump, both all tying into the power supply. And then the V out 1, which is this yellow wire, common, goes to ground post because everything's tied in the ground there. I should receive my, according to the schematics and the hookup or the installation documentation, I should receive a 0 to 5 volt linear signal on here, which has a relationship to ethanol content. And as you'll see, I'm going to power the setup on. And so it's just literally free running fuel through this guy. You can actually feel the flow of the fuel moving through the line. And I know the pump's good because I tested it just a second ago on my flow bench. So pump's running, sitting about 5 amps. We're at roughly 12 volts. The box, the device is on. There is it's kind of hard to see here. There is looks like a yellowish green LED on. Like if I turn this power supply off, it goes out. If I turn the whole thing back on, LED comes on. So I know the board's on. It's not like I've reverse polarity anything. And then the flex fuel sensor, I don't really have a way to test it other than to break out the scope and test the native output from the sensor. But the holding the board here, and just from experience, I've experienced this before. These guys do get a little bit warm up here, but it doesn't seem to be out of the ordinary. And as you can see, it doesn't really. I don't have anything. I don't have anything going on my actual meter. It just shows roughly ground. And if I disconnect it from the yellow, and we drop back down to 0. If I connect the orange wire, which is V out 2, I get a steady 1 volt. If I go back to V out 1, I go back to ground. But if I disconnect the flex fuel sensor itself, the pigtail from the sensor, put this thing down and disconnect it. So if I disconnect it, it's disconnected. Reading is still roughly ground. If I connect it, all of a sudden I get half a volt. So I know the box is alive, it's doing stuff. That could probably, that half a volt right there could more or less be a borderline, like almost like a reference point, or maybe even an error output. Just like whenever something happens that can't make sense of, it just outputs this voltage. But that's what it seems like it's doing. So I really don't know where to go from here, whether the box is faulty or the sensor's faulty. But I'm just looking for any input, because these guys were kind of expensive, $200 or so, roughly $200. It was like 170. I just want to get anybody's input to see if I can get this thing troubleshot. I do have a scope if I need to pull that out and natively test the sensor, but just looking for some feedback. Thank you.